Let's talk a little bit about the writer's room. Can you take
Sure.
us through what a typical day looks like?
Yeah. A typical day is not typical at all. Um, writers' rooms, I wish everybody had a chance to be in a writer's room because that's how you learn to write television. And I'll argue that's how you could learn to write film too. They're slightly different beasts, film and TV writing. But the Venn diagram is about 75% the same, but I think television writing is a little more, each scene has to have a little more purpose, a little more drive into the next. You can't take the time with emotion sometimes that film does. I'm kind of old school. I'm still writing toward act breaks and the, WWJWW, what would Joss Whedon write kind of style of writing because we were so into act breaks on Buffy.
Yeah.
But a typical day is spent just saying what if a lot and how about. And so on a show like Good Witch, which I most recently ran, if we come in with a blank slate and we're trying to break a new story, the morning will be spent just kind of talking about an idea, general ideas. We hardly put anything up on the whiteboard. We have a writer's assistant sitting there writing down everything we say, most everything we say, but stuff that just in case we want to come back to, some what ifs or maybe some lines of dialogue will come out. And we'll start shaping a story and just kind of talking about, hey, well, that idea seems to have enough beats for a story. And then by that, and we generally would spend about 2 days breaking a story. Come from the beginning of one day to the end of the next day, we would have a full whiteboard.
Can you explain what breaking a story means?
Yeah. So breaking is basically coming up with all the beats, right? So it's not just saying, and then this happens, and then this happens, and this happens. It's deciding where they happen and who's going to be in each scene. And we'd either use a whiteboard with different color markers, or I now kind of use big 4x6 Post-its and we write on them. And so we'll come up with a story idea. And generally in television, I think it's about coming up with, well, what are the good scenes? There's the story. What are the good scenes that are going to be a part of that story? And I think this works for film too. I did a little tiny bit of work with Steve Odekirk, who wrote and directed like Bruce Almighty and Ace Ventura. Yeah. And he said that when he's writing comedy, all he does is come up with 3 funny scenes and then tie the movie around those 3 scenes. So I'm convinced that he thought, I want to see Jim Carrey come out of the butt of a cow. So he figured out how to write that into the movie, right?
Yeah.
And it's you might not get the deepest movies out of that, but I still think that when you come up with a story, the first part of your thinking about that story should be, what are the good scenes that are going to come out of that? What are the good moments, the set pieces, the big key moments?
Yeah.
I remember with Bill Steinkeller on Cheers, which had a teaser and 2 acts. He said, well, once you come up with the teaser and the act break, you're halfway done breaking the story. And it's partially true. Because what happens is, even on a show like Good Witch, which I'm not saying is the most genius, intricately connected story show, but you come up with that idea and you think, ooh, that'll lead to a scene in Act 4 where this happens. So then you put that scene up on the board.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, well, if that's going to happen in Act 4, we need to start planting that maybe in Act 1. Oh, and then maybe we could do this twist at the end of Act 2 that kind of takes a detour. And then now we've taken that detour, how do we get back to this? And then you start figuring out that. And you're generally kind of talking about one story at a time. Same on 70s Show. We just kind of put up, we're doing an Eric Donna story where we were talking about before cameras were rolling Eric's panties. This episode of Eric's panties. We're really doing a story about Donna gets jealous that Eric is spending time with another girl who likes him, and so, well, what if we throw a pair of panties into the story, because that makes every story better, right? But then we figure out, oh, well, what if she thinks this, and what if she thinks this? Well, we're going to have a great scene at the end where she confronts him, and then we learn that actually whose the panties they were, and they were actually Midge's panties, because Bob and Midge were in the Vista Cruiser. So we know we're going there, so we want to start planting. When you come up with that idea, we want to make sure we plant a Bob and Midge beat earlier that shows how they're being amorous, right? And just kind of in the background. We don't really notice it, but I'm pretty sure that beat is somewhere in the story. So then we've broken all that, and then we go, oh, now we need something for Kitty and Red. So we come up with a Kitty and Red story that may have nothing to do, on that 70s show, I'd had nothing to do maybe with the other story.
Sure.
On something like Curb Your Enthusiasm or Seinfeld, they definitely would have like intertwined things. But you're just kind of putting those beats on the board. Sometimes you're going, that first act break, that's happening too early. Let's make that the third act break. Or I might look at the story. Joss Whedon was infamous, at least when we were on the show, of kind of, Rob and I would spend the day breaking a story on our own, and Joss would come in at the end of the day and said, yeah, make the fourth act break the first act break. So we'd move everything, erase the board, and start over. And he was generally right. Let's have that much story happening quickly. Yeah. So then end of the second day, you've got a few beats up on the board, but you're not married to anything. And then you start to see the holes and realize, oh, we're missing this character.
Okay.
And then the next day, we're figuring out how can we intersect stories. When I took over Good Witch, almost every scene, only one thing was happening, and that I hate when only one thing is happening. So I try to make sure at least 2 stories were happening in every scene, intersecting. We can bring this person in here. Maybe we can have all 4 stories mentioned in a scene. Certainly on a show like that 70s show, when you get to the 360s where they're sitting in the circle,
right,
you try to kind of touch on all the stories that are going on. You know, Eric is thinking about Donna, Fez is trying to get a date, maybe Hyde is having a fight with Kelso or something, or Kelso's having some conflict. You try to kind of get all that. So that's what I mean by intersecting. And that's something I really look for in television writing, is how much are stories intersecting rather than just one thing. So then by the end of the second day, and by the way, some shows take a week or 2 weeks to break stories.
Wow.
On the shows I've been on, I don't know if I'm lazy or efficient or a combination of both, but generally I just want to get something into the hands of the network so they can, because I've worked for networks that have very specific needs, and want to say, is this story okay? So by the end of the second day, you have the board pretty much full, and then you send somebody off to write a beat sheet, take all those board beats and put it on 2 or 3 pages. And then the next day in the room, or 2 days later, they'd bring the beat sheet back to the room and we'd talk about it for half a day. Or say, oh, we're missing this, or I don't think this story holds up. And then they'd go off and write an outline, and then they'd bring the outline back, a 10 to 12 page outline, and we'd spend at least another half a day or a day talking about that. So even on a show like Good Witch, which again, it has its benefits, it's not Game of Thrones, it's not Succession or The Americans or anything. I'm just saying, but you've spent an entire week, 40 hours in the room before the first word is written in the script.
Right.
And I really use that as a template when I talk to other writers about how much time they should be spending before they even get to writing fade in. You've worked the story with other people, and you've written a beat sheet, brought it back, looked at it, seeing if it all works, seeing if there's any holes. What happens when I would use different colors for different stories, because in television it's really about the balance, and sometimes I'm going, oh, we haven't touched on the C story in 3 acts, we just got to find a way to bring them in. It might not advance the story at all, but it just reminds people, oh, this story is going on.
Yeah.
At which point then as a writer you want to come up with a beat that does advance it, so you might change the ending a little bit so that it has a little bit more. But honestly, on 70s, Good Witch, and Buffy, you end up looking at the board as kind of color-coded and make sure we need a red beat here, or we haven't had any story from the green story at all in there. So that's generally what goes on in the writer's room for an hour-long show. Half hour is a little bit different because 70s show, we shot on Friday nights. We'd have a read-through every Monday morning of the scripts that were already written. After the writer goes off and writes a script, they'd bring it back and we'd spend a day doing punch-up before we did the read-through. And then the next day, in the afternoon, there'd be a run-through, and we'd do a rewrite and punch-up, and then the next day there'd be another run-through at the end of the day. So Tuesday and Wednesdays, we'd be spending breaking story, but Mondays after the read-through, we'd be punching it up and rewriting. Sometimes the network wouldn't like it. Sometimes they'd throw out the script completely. We'd have to completely re-break the story.
Right.
Or we'd say, boy, this episode really starts out well, but the ending isn't working, or this scene just wasn't funny at all. We need a bunch of new jokes in this scene, and we'd spend the day working on that. Okay. And then Tuesday and Wednesday, story breaking, rewriting at the end of each day. Friday, then we'd film it, of course.